We've heard a lot of talk recently about the deep state. Who really runs the government? Is it corrupt or not? Let's find out along with my special guest. Mark, thanks so much for joining me today. Good to be here, Stephen. So, this is Professor Mark Moyer from Hillsdale, and we're going to talk about some big news. I wanted to start with a statement from Tucker Carlson. He said, "You can elect any president you want in the United States, but a small group of people you've never heard of still run everything year after year, administration after administration. It's not a democracy, it's an oligarchy." Many of us wonder if Biden is running the country, or even under another president, there are layers and layers of employees who never leave. Who really runs the government, and is it corrupt? Yes, this story goes back a long way to the US government. Originally, they were just replacing all the officials after elections. Then they realized we needed continuity, so they put in people with longer tenure. And in the progressivist era, they decided that experts are very smart, and we need more experts. But the problem is that now most government officials work their entire careers, making it almost impossible to fire them. It also cultivates the idea that they are some kind of privileged class and in many cases have lost touch with the reality they are supposed to serve, the American people. During my time in the Trump administration, I have found that there are virtuous people in government, but there are also those who have convinced themselves that government exists mainly to support themselves and not the American people. Professor Gad Saad was recently on Joe Rogan's show, and he mentioned that having a permanent position gives him the courage to do things he would normally be fired for. You mentioned that there are people in the government acting outside the bounds of what is acceptable or imposing their agenda. Don't you think this is because they know they probably won't get fired? Yes, I think you are right, because they are not afraid to do their job poorly. I've seen cases in government where people who perform poorly are almost impossible to fire. At worst, they are transferred somewhere where they have almost no responsibilities, which is fine with them because they can continue their political activism or hobbies. You mentioned that you were part of the Trump administration. What position did you serve in under President Trump? Yes, I was assigned to the U.S. Agency for International Development in the Senior Executive Service and ran the Office of Civil-Military Cooperation, which was responsible for our development agency's interaction with the Department of Defense. So I spent a lot of time at both the agency and the department. Many states like Massachusetts, San Francisco, and other mostly blue regions are now redistributing tax dollars to illegal immigrants rather than veterans and seniors. What do you think of this? It seems like a real insult to me as an American citizen, but if I were a veteran who may have given his life, limbs, and mental health to serve his country, or a senior citizen who has paid taxes all his life, to see this money going to illegal immigrants and not me would be offensive. Yes, it is outrageous, and I think most Americans are outraged by it. But again, here we're dealing with career bureaucrats, most of whom are left of center, many of whom think we should have sanctuary cities. And it's very difficult to hold these people accountable. And that was one of the biggest things that frustrated me about government. People break the law all the time, but seem to do it with impunity. Interesting. Do you think part of it is a desire to appear kind? Like, we'll be nice to immigrants and let them in, but then the other 99% of people who deserve those benefits are left without them. Think about Europe. It has taken in a lot of illegal immigrants. And now, these people are sucking all the juice out of their welfare systems and schools. Essentially, taxpayers are funding a takeover of their own country. Yes, that's definitely one reason, the desire to feel like virtuous people. But there are other motives as well. For example, some of them believe that the country is full of disgusting people, and we need to bring in people from somewhere else to dilute those disgusting people. And they also realize in the Democratic Party that they're losing white working class, Latino, and African American voters. So they need to import voters from somewhere else who will depend on them and become a reliable constituency when they get the right to vote. Interesting. By the way, I read today on Breitbart News or Zero Hedge that Trump has pulled almost 50% of potential Latino voters from Biden and up to 30% of African Americans to his side. The Democratic Party is in a panic because it has long used and exploited these electoral groups. People are saying, "I can't even buy groceries, why would I vote for you?" And there's a big shift happening. One thing, Professor, that I'd like to ask your opinion on. You've written a lot about Vietnam. We're seeing war between Ukraine and Russia. between Israel and the Gaza Strip. Do you see any parallels between these wars, the American people and Vietnam, especially the protests on college campuses? Yes, I see some parallels. In the case of Ukraine, the Biden administration presented no vision of victory. In the beginning, they seem to have naively assumed that the Russians would surrender, but now it's obvious that that didn't happen. And we find ourselves in a situation where Ukrainians continue to die, and they can't sustain that indefinitely. That was part of the problem in Vietnam as well. The circumstances were different. In Vietnam, we did have some things we could have done, but the government, especially Lyndon Johnson, did not come up with a viable plan for victory. The American people don't want to fight or even support a war that seems to have no prospect of winning. And the protests we see on campuses are very reminiscent of the Vietnam-era protests. In my opinion, the anti-war movement of that time was very ill-informed. A lot of people joined it simply as a way to oppose the government and their parents. And we see a lot of similar things today in these campus protests. These people don't really know much about what they're talking about, but they have a general discontent and they want to stir things up. I think we'll see some interesting parallels at the upcoming Democratic National Convention. In my opinion, these protesters will divide the Democratic Party as they did in 1968. So one of the potentially positive outcomes is it will make it easier for Trump to get re-elected. BURNETT. All right, yes, very interesting. I wanted to ask your opinion because I saw you mentioned this on your Twitter. Is it considered racist to call someone who entered the country illegally an illegal immigrant or an illegal alien? I see that kids are now being suspended from school and penalized for using this phrase instead of newcomer or migrant. What are your thoughts on this? Yes, I think the pressure from the left to redefine the term into undocumented worker, removing the word illegal, is a disaster because it takes away the realization that these people are breaking the law. And they are clearly breaking the law. And I think it's worth pointing that out, especially when we're going to indulge them more and more and give them all kinds of benefits. So I think when I was younger, I think the term illegal immigrant was used. Now even illegal immigrant is considered something reprehensible. But I don't think we should accept the imposed language police and use their terminology. I think it's perfectly fine to call things by their proper names. And the idea of penalizing someone for using that term is, in my opinion, ludicrous. We have the First Amendment, and to claim that this is some kind of hate speech is ridiculous, because obviously they're illegal and obviously they're immigrants. You know, I think of Professor Jordan Peterson who fought this in Canada, where there's no free speech, and they were constantly trying to force him to use a certain language. They had a real language police, but I still say illegal immigrants because, as you said, they are indeed immigrants. And I recognize that they are also here illegally. I don't call legal immigrants illegal because they came here legally. Yeah, right. It's like the situation in the novel 1984, where the rulers say, okay, we may not be able to control people directly, but if we start controlling their language, we can shape their behavior in a certain way to achieve the desired result. Absolutely right. That's what's behind all these new euphemisms they're introducing. Okay, you have a book out. I'd like to ask you about it. It's a great title, Masters of Corruption: How the Federal Bureaucracy Sabotaged the Trump Administration. Tell us what we learned from reading it. The book is mostly about my experience at the U.S. Agency for International Development, but in many ways it's a microcosm of the administration as a whole. I went in there thinking I would mostly do policy. I had written several books on international development, but once there, I was appointed to a senior position, and I soon discovered that there was corruption going on in my own office. I tried to fix it. I went to the senior human resources people and told them about it. And they said, it's good that you're telling us about it, because most of the managers here just ignore these things so as not to damage relationships and upset other people. I said, I'm not going to do that. We need to do something about it. So we launched an investigation. Eventually, one of the worst offenders was expelled from the agency. But in the process of fighting corruption, I provoked a backlash from other bureaucrats, and they started coming after me. So the book tells the story of how those who try to solve a problem become targets for vicious retaliation. In terms of the many lawsuits against Donald Trump now, do you see this as basically another targeted campaign using legal warfare to prevent him from having a second term as president? What's your opinion on that? Yes, it's again what I've seen in government. You can find an excuse to attack anybody. You can stir up some little thing and go on the offensive. The question is, are they prosecuting anyone else for such minor transgressions besides Donald Trump? And the answer in most cases is no. They are purposefully targeting him specifically. I think it sets a terrible precedent. We should not institute a tradition of prosecuting every former president for some minor offense. If he had done something really serious, then of course he should be prosecuted. But to prosecute a former president for things that no one else would be prosecuted for is, in my opinion, a real problem for our society. I agree with you completely, Professor Mark Moyer. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you for an interesting interview. I thank everyone who watched to the end. Support the channel by liking and subscribing so you don't miss new interesting videos. I wish you all a wonderful day and a great mood.